Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Good evening and welcome to Soft Cover. Today we are unveiling Chinmay Tumbe's book, The Age of Pandemics, published by Harper Collins. In fact, keeping up with the times, we are unmasking it. Today's is also a special edition of Soft Cover as we have an elite panel to talk about the book and about pandemics in general. We have with us Chinmay Tumbe, author of the book and faculty at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Madam Sujatha Rao, former Secretary, Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. Welcome both of you. Without further ado, let's unmask the book. If all of you can please.
Yeah.
So Chinmay, tell us about the book. You talk about how your son got you thinking about a book of this sort.
Yes, it happened in March. The thinking behind the book really started in March, on March 12th or March 11th, 12th, when the WHO announced the word pandemic, which is now really caught on everywhere. And in the house, my son, was very curious to know about this, what are pandemics and has it happened in the past? And given that, I have been reading about this through my migration research, because pandemics often have migration, and I've been working a lot on migration for the last 10 years. I kind of had a sense of what to tell him. But very quickly, he also pointed out that some of these terms are well known. So I said there's influenza, and he said, influenza is mentioned in the Tintin and so on. And then I realized, epidemics, pandemics, they're there in popular memory in certain ways, but often if it's not been written about, it kind of quickly dies out. And what I had in my mind in March was influenza in India, for example. So many millions of deaths, and really there's no book-length treatment to it. Then there's cholera, there's plague. And I also was thinking, you're talking about the Black Death. So suddenly when COVID struck, 14th century Black Death was, all over the newspapers and so on. And I thought to myself, look, there's something in India as well, something very ghastly which, happened, and that needs to be written about. So that's really the thinking behind, the book.
Mm-hmm. Madam, what did you think of the book?
I thought it was a fabulous book. It was really, truly a fabulous book. And coming from Chinmay, who I don't associate as a health person, I was just amazed how he got into that kind of, first of all, the interest, and then the level of detail, the amount of research he must have done. I consider myself a health person, but even I didn't know half the things or more than half the things that he had mentioned. It was absolutely a fascinating journey that he took us through with the cholera and the plague and influenza epidemics. Really, Chinmay, you've done a very good job, and my heartiest congratulations. And I'm going to recommend this book almost to everyone and anyone that I meet for the next 1 month.
Thank you.
After that, I think people will stop listening to me.
I hope
they would have bought their own book by then.
Or I hope the pandemic is over. Yeah.
No, this will be over, another will come. You can never get rid of the pandemics. They're a part of us now.
That's true.
But it's a very good contribution. And I really think many people in India must read, first of all, our policymakers. Because there's so many lessons. If we had known this, could have guided us in how to deal with the present pandemic, which I have several reservations about. We could have done better. So it's always easy to sit and criticize, but I don't mean to say it in that spirit. I mean to say that knowledge and knowledge of history is very important not to repeat past mistakes and to guide us to do something better. So it's always very, very important to document and to know history. And unfortunately, we are not very good at documentation, unlike the British. And I think, Chinmay, you got all the details only because it was the British who kept the records. And to us, you would have still had some Manusmritis telling you about some cholera or something like that,
That is true, actually. A lot of the statistics come from their records.
Yeah. So,
in fact, we are using a British law to actually fight this pandemic. So the Epidemic Diseases Act 1897 was passed when Lord Elgin was the Viceroy of India.
Right. Yeah.
So, Tumbe, you actually asked the question that, COVID-19 is better understood. I mean, you ask whether it is better understood in the light of the age of pandemics. What's your reply?
I think the first reactions, there are many things which happen. Pandemics are surprise events. They don't come, very often. And whenever it comes, it takes people by storm. But there's a pattern to it. So while each disease is unique, while each pandemic is unique, there are some clearly discernible patterns. So one is, how does the news come and play? There's this instant sort of, first a sense of denial that nothing is going to happen, then a sense of sort of panic mode, a lot of aggressive actions, and then also all this idea of acceptance. Like today, people in India going around without masks, which is not on, but unfortunately that's happening. Some of the other things which I talk about in the book is, for example, migration, which is a topic close to my heart. And in India, we unfortunately had this massive migration crisis earlier on in the year. And what we learned from past pandemics is that migration is the most obvious and anticipable thing that happens during a pandemic. That is, people are scared and hence they want to go, or economic activity shuts down. And if you have a huge circular migrant workforce like we've had historically in India, then people are going to go home. So when the plague hit, for example, in the 1890s, people said, "Marna hai to gaon mein marenge." And this was a psychology. The same lines were heard even today in India. What that also means is that if you're going to take any action, now, of course, there's a huge spectrum of views on what action to be taken. And whatever you do, some person will say, "Oh, you could have done this." But I do think the lockdown in India, which was, of course, important, but the manner of the planning, it didn't really have anything for migrant workers. The lockdown speech had nothing for migrant workers. And so, not surprisingly, we found this massive migration crisis for almost 2 months, in late March, April, and May. And that to me was, again, like, Sujatha said, that you can learn something from history. And out here, the learning was that you have to anticipate a potential migrant. So you have two options. You either facilitate that transfer, first up, or you ensure that they have all the provisions. Neither was done. And I think that was a big handicap. So that's one aspect. Then there's stigmatization, the idea of the super spreader. We saw all of these things almost predictably. And all of this has happened in past pandemics as well. The blame game, even the naming, this idea of the Chinese virus. Now, yes, a lot of people don't like China in India because of this geopolitical war that's happening. But to call any disease by its name, as I point out, cholera was an Indian disease for much of the world. They blamed it, they called it India cholera. And really, diseases don't really, go by nationality, in the sense that it often becomes endemic in other parts. So there are various, smaller themes which I touch upon in that, especially that last chapter, which looks at the reflection.
Ma'am, this book also talks about how there was possibly undercounting of deaths in the past, especially rural deaths. Do you think some of that is happening in India right now?
Absolutely. Our census on registration of births and deaths is still very incomplete and very faulty. In fact, recording was the last count, about 22% of the deaths have been counted, and it was only once, I think, Prabhat Jha, who is an epidemiologist who's based in Canada, did a 1 million death study. That means he took 1 million deaths and actually did oral autopsies and tried to figure out what could have been the cause of death. Otherwise, typically you die and they say heart failure. And well, naturally, everyone gets a heart failure. Ultimately, you have to die when the heart stops. But that's not the cause of death, actually. And so because of this kind of recording, we do also show up saying that lots of heart diseases and a lot of people are dying due to heart ailments and all that, which may not necessarily be the right fact. Right. So our basic recording of cause of death is very, very incomplete and very faulty. And we need to really step it up in a big way. And since it's still in that stage of incompleteness, I'm quite sure that in India, under COVID, many might have not reported the right figures of deaths taking place, particularly in the northern states and so on. But having said that, in a disease like COVID, unlike in plague or unlike, say, in cholera, where there are physical symptoms like, loose motions, watery motions, and so on, or in plague, there is a rat and there is a certain behavior, certain symptoms that come up and so on. In COVID, the symptoms are so close to dengue, they're so close to influenza, they're so close to so many other diseases that often enough misclassification can happen, in the sense that if I have a heart failure and I get COVID, did I die due to my heart ailment, which is a pre-existing disease, or did I die due to COVID? It's difficult to say, because COVID could have triggered and made my existing condition worse. So this cause of death misclassification is what we refer to it. This is very possible, and it does often happen. Even in US, it's happened. In Tamil Nadu, it happened. So there was a re-estimation of deaths caused on account of COVID because of this kind of misclassification. But for all that, you need to have a very good and a sound health system, which is looking at data very closely and is able to understand where there's a misclassification, which could be due to genuine reasons, not mischievous, but genuine mistake of trying to classify where do you put this cause of the death due to, and also due to non-reporting. So this whole area of death registration itself, I'm afraid a lot of work needs to be done to get the right estimates. And I feel that that's very important, because you can never get on top of an epidemic or a pandemic unless you have a very sound data system to tell you how the trajectory moved. For example, if you think that nobody got infected in Bihar, nobody died in Bihar, you'll think that, okay, fine, nothing happens in Bihar, and you just carry on. But we don't know how many were asymptomatics, how many have really died due to COVID. There's no such information at all. How many were tested? What was the denominator? Nothing is known. So that's the reason why I give a lot of emphasis to not only the accuracy of data, but transparency and the correctness of data being given a very high value when you're dealing with pandemics. Even if it is politically inconvenient, that rigor of truth is something that's very important for ourselves, for our ability to control it tomorrow.
Right. Talking of about recording data, Chinmay, you talk about the epidemics that had happened in the Byzantine Empire during Columbus's time, and several others from very long ago. So, what is it that makes 1817 to 1920 the age of pandemics? Is it possible that that the recording was better then, so we have access to that information unlike the earlier ones?
I mean, it's always a possibility in history that somebody, going down in the future finds that there was a huge epidemic outbreak in the 1700s, 18. But I would say very unlikely. It's probably the case that we might find something in the future, something before 1500. But from the world from 1500 to now, if there was something of a pandemic, it would have been registered in traveler records. Some memory of that would be there. Right? So I'm very confident that at least between the Black Death and now, there is really only one other big period in history where we really can call pandemics. And the whole rationale for 1817 to 1920, let me just lay that out. This is a particular century in history where the percentage of deaths in a pandemics, right, as a percentage of, say, population in the midpoint of this period is about 5%. And that's a huge number. If you look at what's happened after 1920, that number is less than 1%. And most of that, if you call HIV as a pandemic. Yeah. So the period, between 1870 and 19, nothing happened before, which was as dramatic, and nothing happened after, except for this, what we're calling as this 6th century plague and the 14th century plague. And it's about 3 different diseases, and they're truly pandemics. Even Black Death was, pretty much around the Mediterranean world and Europe. All 3, cholera, plague, and influenza, touched each and every continent at varying intensities. But this is, in a way, even larger in geographic scope than the Black Death period. And of particular interest for India, because the epicenter of mortality for each disease, that is the cholera pandemic, the plague pandemic, and influenza, was India. Right? So it's not even the case that, other countries were affected, but India was disproportionately affected. So, of course, you can ask why, why this period? Of course, there's an element of chance. That is, there's this idea that diseases. So, for example, cholera was there even before 1817. But what the consensus seems to say now in the scientific community is that the strain of cholera, just like the strain of this particular coronavirus, is different. And that's what really changes in 1817 and spreads around the world. Similarly with plague, it's always been endemic in certain places, but it breaks out with some virulence in the late 19th century. So that is why this period is very special. Now, this period has been forgotten in European and Western history from the framework of pandemics, because this is the period where they grew very rich. So the standard accounts of the 19th century is about why did the West grow richer than the East, for example. That's a big framing. Or Eric Hobsbawm had this, age of empires. This is an era of empires. So in Indian history, we look at this period as the rise and fall of British rule, fall happening in the 1940s. But this is pretty much a story of colonial era kind of a period. And what the book is trying to put is that, look, of course, all of this is true, but this is also a time of extremely high death rates. And death rates by the late 19th century are actually increasing. So not only are death rates high in history before 1920, but in India, actually, they were increasing for almost 30, 40 years leading up to the influenza. So this is a very extraordinary period of history, which in India, we are completely looking through the prism of colonialism, that is politics. But what I'm arguing is that this was also a period of epidemics. Another way of arguing is that the biggest enemy, arguably, was not, for the British was not the Indians, and for the Indians was not British. For both of them, it was infectious disease. The day-to-day lives of people on the subcontinent in this period was, how do we not get some diseases? And that is why this particular period is so important.
But is it possible that governance was one of the factors that was responsible for this high death rates, and also other things contributed to the death rates, say malnutrition, all of which can be traced back to governance? So, in fact, I had this question in mind for Madam, because, you've been an administrator. Are these high deaths, ma'am, is it possible that it is because there was colonial rule, like you said, that we have this book now because the British documented it, but is it because of the British that the deaths were so high?
Absolutely. No doubt in my mind. No, but then the counter question would be, if the Mughals were ruling, would it have been lesser? Now, one can't have a comparator like that. It's not easy to do.
No, I'm comparing with democracy, ma'am.
Well, those days in the 18th century, democracy was still kind of.
There's no doubt that today's world, in a democratic system, you're going to have lesser deaths than that. Yes. Hopefully, that's definitely the case.
No, but in this case, imperialism did have a big impact. We were a colony, and there was this whole, taking away of the surplus. I mean, we got impoverished. We know how our food grains and all were going to feed the World War soldiers, or later on, Churchill himself talks about the East Bengal famine in the 40s was caused, and how they took shiploads of our food instead of for our people, it was taken away to feed their soldiers. So it has always been, and the priorities of the colonial rule was also more on railways, which, Chinmay alludes to all these kind of reasons. And I think very forcefully you bring out, Chinmay, on the role of hunger and nutrition in contributing to deaths. Infectious diseases, okay, influenza was one thing, but the underlying causal factor of malnutrition and pure hunger was a very, very major factor for making them susceptible to the scale at which they got sick and died. So acute impoverishment and acute hunger would definitely and did definitely contribute to the large number of deaths. And so though there is, of course, you can say the British rule was concerned, and they brought in these whole, the urban planning concept of, what did you call them?
City improvement boards and so on.
Improvement, those improvement trusts that were set up, which then led to urban planning. They did bring that, they brought an act and so on and so forth. And they did try to bring in a bit of science in bringing in quarantine concepts and so on and so forth. But overall, the macro policy of colonial rule of hunger and deprivation and lack of nutrition did definitely contribute to a larger number of deaths. And then even the allopathy treatment or drugs or something was just left only to their own cantonment area. They never did invest very much on health. They invested on railways, but they didn't really invest on health. Health was not a priority for them. So, and understandably, I mean, they're in imperial power. Why should they bother, I suppose? But that's how the nature of imperialism is.
Yeah, so, I'll just add on just a point on that. A lot of what you said, I completely agree with. Of course, you have to make, so the counterpart of there was the princely states, so what were the princely states of India doing? Some of them did well, some of them did not, right? I think the real argument on colonialism is the lack of investment in public health. Right? And arguably, this kind of has persisted even in post-independence India. That is, even today, our health issues are very low. But what I'm trying to point out is often they kind of understood how to control cholera, for example, in UK. And this is, John Snow's sort of idea of transmission of how cholera goes. So by the late 19th century, cholera is no longer a problem in Britain. And yet it continues to be a problem in India. And as I point out, it's amazing that the British medical officers in India, part of the Indian Medical Service, actually are opposed to the idea of the waterborne transmission of cholera. Yeah. And it's a really unfortunate part of history that for about 30 years, there's a stubborn scientific resistance. These are scientific officers, but they adhere to a different scientific theory. And so as a result of which, it doesn't. And the Maharaja of Travancore, for example, knows intuitively that he looks at, particular a sort of a outlier in the Indian medical service. A British officer is saying, look, it's actually water. And the Maharaja of Travancore says, look, I like this guy's idea, and maybe we should invest something and do something with waterworks. So there are these different ideas on scientific transmission. And what's unfortunate for India is that some of the positions the medical establishment back then took was actually not, on hindsight, scientific. They believed in what they were doing, but it was not correct. Similarly with plague, a lot of intervention initially, but the transmission was simply not known. It took a long time to actually establish that plague is transferred from rodents to humans via rat fleas. This was simply not known when it first struck. And so that's why there was a lot of confusion, and the British really did not quite know, how to handle this, especially in India. Last point is about the famines and it is true that in the late 19th century, there was some severe droughts, and that was acute water scarcity, which did kind of bring down nutrition levels. And there's no doubt that, this infection disease acted on that.
So this thing about waterborne, that theory not getting enough supporters, this is a little bit like right now we're talking about whether this is airborne, whether this is mite transmission. It's very, and then actually, that's the amazing part about the book. While I was reading it, there were so many parallels. For example, you talk about these rumors in Bombay in 1898 during the plague epidemic that, British were removing some fluid from the dead bodies. And I instantly thought of plasma, to cure themselves, they were removing this fluid. Do you think it's some sort of archaic reference to that?
Yeah, I mean, if you see some of the actual practices of medicine, of a variety of things, I think there's a lot one can interpret. I wouldn't really, interpret it that way. But there's no doubt that many of the things that we see what they were doing back then to understand transmission and so on have very strong echo, like you mentioned, this airborne, waterborne kind of thing, even today, right? So, but all I'd say is that, one of the key things of countering pandemics is to figure out transmission very early on. In cholera, it took decades to understand transmission. In plague, it took about half a decade. And influenza, in a way, they never actually figured out influenza back then. It was a complete mystery. So it's really more about, understanding transmission. And yes, there's a lot of fear. So what you're referring to, this, this idea of momai, or this fluid which people are taking away from the body. It was a sort of a rumor, and a lot of rumors abound in India back then about how exactly the disease is spread. Another classic rumor is that the wells are poisoned, for example. And this has references in the plague, 14th century plague, also has references in India in the 19th century. So it's amazing as to how people's psychology also gears up in a pandemic. People really start panicking and start attributing blame to a variety of sources.
Ma'am, the Indian health system so well. Is there something apart from the Epidemic Diseases Act that we have sort of, got from that era? That's still a part of the health system?
Well, we haven't learned our lessons. Almost every intervention, public health intervention that they did, as Chinmay brings out in the book, of, using masks, isolating, maintaining social distance. I mean, these are all words that we're still using for keeping people away from infecting each other. Now, those are all lessons and then the biggest lesson I feel is that the British, being a colonial power, used the power of fear to try and instill social discipline. And that, in the end, it got mixed up with the already alienated people from their, imperial power and a foreign rule. And that was already there. And then they felt that your measures, whether it was for smallpox or whether it was to control STDs, sexually transmitted infections, which were very high order, and infecting their own soldiers, and they were very worried about that. So in all these things, they did bring in very, very harsh laws to try and segregate people and remove them from their homes. So they had this highly ritualistic society, and they felt that these foreigners were trying to interfere with their customs and their culture and so on. So this sense of alienation from their own, from the British government was very clear to see, and the inability to therefore bring in any kind of discipline in the people to follow public health measures. Now, if you see traces of that here too, in COVID, if I were to critique today's COVID policy of the government of India, we've done many wonderful things, I'm sure. But one thing we failed, apart from the migrant, which is, of course, Chinmay will probably talk a bit more about and is very evident, is the lack of communication and enough public participation. And we never really encouraged the civil society or never encouraged.
We've actually used fear again.
Again, they use fear. The policemen coming, section 144, and this. They are important. They have their role, but it should be based on people's consent. Not that, so with the result, the minute you remove the fear, nobody uses a mask, there's no social discipline at all. So you have to invest a lot of time in trying to make people understand the importance of, that's what public health is all about. Public health is about participation. Public health is based on democratic principles of inclusion, not seclusion, and based on the principles of participation and information and education. Unless the people are informed, they won't change their behavior. So behavior change is fundamental to public health gains. And that's where we messed up now. And the British also had their limitations of enforcing public health laws, largely because they were imperial power from whom the people were very alienated. So any good message also that they would give would be received in a very different light than what would have been otherwise the case.
The book also talks about vaccine hesitancy. Plague inoculations, there was a lot of resistance and the usual rumors about people.
There's so much of suspicion.
Yeah.
Today, I mean, even in polio, you came across cases where Muslims felt that they were being sterilized by taking polio. A lot of work had to be done with them to convince them that it was a polio vaccine, it was not going to make them impotent, and so on. These rumors do come up, and they will come up for the COVID vaccine as well. And that's the reason why there has to be a huge amount of communication, to allay their fears. So I think this book should be read, as I said initially, by policymakers to understand how many mistakes we've made here were known then, and if only we had known our history, we would have not repeated them this time round.
Right. So, ma'am, how much you I think briefly touched upon it, but how much is sort of getting around religious beliefs a problem in public health? You have to deal with them somehow. How much is that an issue? Because the book also deals with that in many places, many of them.
Two aspects. One, this tablighi kind of thing of trying to demonize any whether on caste or communal or social basis is completely wrong. It's antithetical to any principle of public health. Chinmay also notes that this happened even under the British rule. And this happened again here. We tried to, when the government tried to communalize it, and it backfired on them. So that is one extreme example of, bad use of power. But more importantly, yes, religious beliefs do kind of hinder individuals or families or societies' capacity to see signs. And, the more you have, you instill, like you ring a bell and then go corona, go. I mean, this is all superstition. This is not the way you educate your people to have a proper scientific understanding. And therefore you trivialize a very serious issue of public health, which is affecting your lives when you do all this kind of nonsensical superstitious things, So that's the reason why it's very important to bring in scientific evidence, not treat people as if they're infantiles and they don't understand. They understand very well. And when you say you must wear a mask, it's not a dictation. You have to tell them why you must wear a mask. Why? What is the basis? And that has not been done enough. Just giving a farman to say you should do this, you should not do that. It's not enforceable. You cannot have a Durga Pandal and tell people that you maintain social distance. It doesn't happen. So I think there is a lot to do with bringing in science and the logic of public health rationale, and getting people's consent to say, yes, that's important for our benefit and for the benefit of our family. And only then will you get consensual social societal response to public health regulations.
Right. Chinmay, let's talk a little bit about the primary sources that you've used. For example, where did you source that documentary from, the cholera documentary that the missionaries had made?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a wide range of sources used in the book. And I was quite surprised because remember, much of this research was during the lockdown from my campus. So of course I had to rely on a lot of digital records. So the Wellcome Trust is a fantastic, resource. You have the National Library of Scotland, you have some resources in India. And I myself had collected, material on epidemics and migration while I was working on migration from a variety of archival visits I'd done in the past. So some of the first things I did was to collect a massive database of mortality statistics across almost 70 years by disease, and I sort of analyzed that sort of data very closely. I also happened to be in Calcutta a day before the lockdown, a day or two before the lockdown, where I happened to visit the South Park Cemetery. And so I got the burial records, for example, out there, digitized that data set, analyzed the burial records. So just a variety of sets. So this particular thing about cholera and movie, I came across this reference, I started reading about it. And as it turns out, it was on YouTube. So there's no great, secret to where this video is. If you just search this, it's there online. So that's also what I realized, that it meant, the digital revolution, so much of historical resources are now there online. So this particular thing you're talking about is a 1923 video of a particular, missionary propaganda, which kind of shows you also how epidemics are used to convert people. I mean, that's also one side story of this.
Amazing. So fascinating. I think one can just write a whole book on how to collect data.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll talk a little bit of that burial ground, because it's really fascinating. Walked around this burial ground. It's one of the famous cemeteries of India, and you see, so when you walk in a burial ground, I mean, you don't really think of how old they are, or, just see.
You actually even mentioned the Feluda book.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And this particular cemetery has this Feluda, connection as well. In Calcutta, and a lot of famous people, I mean, I mentioned, this guy who died at 22, who was very famous, Anglo-Portuguese person, who kind of is a revolutionary poet and who is talking against the British. There's also Charles Darwin's son, for example, who's buried out there. But apart from that, when you actually look at the records, and you see it on a spreadsheet, it's amazing. Firstly, most of them are women. That's not written out there, but actually most of them are women. Or not most of them, but about 40% of those bodies are there women. More than 20% are actually kids. Right? That's something when you see these large tombstones, you never realize actually such high percentage of the people in cemeteries, especially back then, that when you had infant mortality rates very high, were actually little children. And that's what comes out from that database. But what it also shows you is that in 1817, the numbers start going up. And that's why the book starts at 1817. So this was a nice way to actually, because we know that something happened in 1817, but for a researcher, I need to know what was there before. What if actually deaths were even higher before 1817? Then maybe 1817 is not a special year. And so this was a very chance discovery to find this burial records to show that the line was flat before 1817, and then it jumps up, and then it stays high for quite some time. So a lot of chance discoveries of sources. You mentioned this video. There's this burial grounds records. I found this Smriti Chitre, which was translated by Shanta Gokhale just a few years back. It's a Marathi autobiography written in the 1930s of a remarkable life in Western India. And there's a beautiful reference of plague, because this family experienced plague, the daughter of that family. So that's a great, very unique first-person account. And I was looking for a first-person account, very rare to find, but I found this. And in that book, there's a reference to Manmodi as a disease. And interestingly, Manmodi was nothing but influenza in 1980. So when Shanta Gokhale translated this 2 years back, even she did not know what was Manmodi. I'm in conversation with her now. And she looked around, she researched, but no doctor could tell her what was Manmodi. It turns out that from connecting it from other research, that Manmodi was referred to And the sequence of events was very clear. There was a massive drought, and then the disease came, and it destroyed the population. So one part of the book is also to, Shanta Gokhale is very happy that she finally found the mysterious what is Manmodi, and it's nothing but the great influenza of 1918. So these are these, small instances. I mean, literally, this book was lying on my shelf, and I said, I have to get a first-person account whose autobiography has written about plague or influenza. This was a purely chance discovery. So, a lot of fun, moments, like eureka moments while writing, which is always exciting.
And there are some amazing similarities. So when we talk about the 1889-90 flu pandemic, it's called the Nai Sardi Bukhar.
Yeah.
So we are talking about the novel coronavirus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's fascinating. But tell me, how is, you go first and then ma'am, how is this pandemic different? Or what are the challenges that we have here? What are the advantages we have here?
Yeah, obviously the advantages are we have for the first time a World Health Organization. Right? That is, we have a global surveillance system, which had in fact started in the age of pandemics. As I point out, 1851, that first conference, which was there held for cholera. In a way, the intellectual history, if you see why was WHO created in 1948, you can trace it to 1851. It's a series of events from 1851 that culminate in 1858 or 1948 as WHO. So one is we have a global health service. Now, many people criticize WHO for not doing enough and so on, but fundamentally it's WHO which said, look, this is a pandemic and you need to take action. That was early warning, and that is why a lot of countries benefited. There was no such thing in 1918. In fact, a lot of people complained in 1918 that if only the imperial master had told us, we would have taken action. Right? So that's one benefit that we have now, that we have some element of global surveillance. And we said we have better technology. This is also what people said in 1917, because they had conquered plague, they had conquered cholera, and the very next year influenza came. So I'm very skeptical of claims that we have very far better technology now, because
you always have better technology than the past.
Until the next great epidemic, which is completely left you. But what's amazing is that the international collaboration to solve this problem. So very quickly, the transmission was kind of identified very quickly. So that amount of global scientific cooperation and collaboration to come up with a vaccine in record time, these are some of the things which are obviously not there, back then. Also, broadly, barring few countries, most political systems kind of rose up to the challenge. 1918, for example, nobody was thinking. In fact, it was the context of a war. People were trying to hush things down. People were trying to, say that things are not happening. I mean, there's no epidemic, for example. So those are the key differences I see. We have a better health surveillance system, a better idea to understand transmission. The idea of the mask, for example, most countries caught on very quickly. On the other hand, I would say we live in a far more interconnected world, which means, a disease which starts in Wuhan can quickly go around the world in no time. This was also true in 1918, but it's just much more faster now. So on the one hand, we have better surveillance system, but on the other hand, we also have a much, much more interconnected world today. So the probability of a pandemic is also slightly higher in that sense.
Ma'am?
What are the advantages and disadvantages?
How do we compare? I mean, what are the challenges compared to then? What are the...
Well, I agree with Chinmay in the sense that having a WHO, the international connectivity has its plus points in terms of information transmission, but also very efficient disease transmission. I mean, infection also spreads equally efficiently as information does. So the chances of being forewarned is much more in a more connected world like today. But having said that, I also feel that in this epidemic, one thing that is very disturbing is that Wuhan set an example of this lockdown. I am somehow not in favor of this lockdown concept to contain disease. After all, the price, the cost-benefit analysis of a lockdown is so negative. I mean, for all you know, next year we can have, this virus can very well mutate, or a new corona may come, and we can have another spike of huge. How many times are you going to keep shutting down your economy? There have to be better ways of trying to deal with pandemics and live with pandemics, So we had the SARS example. India never learned its lessons. Taiwan did, and Taiwan did much better job because they developed the whole public health surveillance system because of the experience they had of SARS. Now, we've had, in the last 15 years, we've had SARS, we've had H5N1, we've had swine flu, we've had MERS, we've had Ebola, we've had, so there are at least about 7 or 8 pandemics, epidemics, and all that of these viral mutations and viral infections. And we still haven't learned our lessons. Even WHO hasn't really pegged and understood why there's so many outbreaks, viral outbreaks taking place in the world today. I mean, there was an HIV in 88. After that, it was only in 2003 that we again see SARS coming in and viral outbreaks taking place one after the other with such frequency that we should really sit up. That means there's something happening in the environment, there's something happening in the viral world, there's something that we don't understand. We have to do much more research. So internationally, I think our priorities have not been very clear. And in our country, we have never learned enough from being very, very, alert and aware of the need for public health. Public health capacity in India is very poor, extremely poor. So I think that's one lesson we have to learn and quickly. And the second one, but I would say is, because we have a good system of, we've had the memory of HIV containment, we've had the memory of polio eradication, we've been battling with infectious diseases for quite some time. We do have knowledge and we do have the history. Now it's important for government to invest on documenting all this, making sense of this knowledge base and building our own internal capacity to deal with pandemics. That's why I say COVID is not the last word. We should learn to live with COVID for the next few years. It's going to come back in some other way, if not now, a couple of years later. Yeah.
Chinmay, when you talk about inoculations, we see this vaccine nationalism in this pandemic, rich countries buying up vaccines. Did you find that sort of parallel during that era?
Yeah, in the 19th century world, of course, vaccines are a very new thing. The real origin was in smallpox, which is a disease many people might not even have heard of today. Smallpox is really where the vaccination battles were fought in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the sense, quite interestingly, often the vaccines or the inoculations were actually invented in the countries where they were sort of effective. Right? So many of these famous vaccines that we're talking about, the cholera, plague, they kind of actually emerged in the laboratories of India. These were sort of usually European scientists, not just British, but European scientists working in Indian labs who kind of developed these inoculations. Now, did they did they have first priority for these inoculations? Not really. They were developing these inoculations for the population that they were serving, and hence often India got the first. I think what's different is the effectiveness. The effectiveness of vaccines back then was not as effective. I mean, today the technology of vaccination improved so much that if you claim that it works, then it pretty much works. Back then, the focus was, how effective is a vaccine? And there was nothing like 100% effective vaccine. That's why even Hafkin, who's a sort of a hero in this book, who can get sidelined in the bureaucracy later on, he's very passionate about his vaccines, but it's not very clear to demonstrate its power. So even on cholera, pilgrimage routes were classic sort of transmitter of the diseases. They started compulsory inoculation on pilgrimages only in the 1930s, about 40 years after people started talking. So I think the context is very different in the sense that because the pandemics back then, especially cholera and plague, was so concentrated on India and a few countries, influenza is different. But for these two diseases, at least, the vaccine sort of strategies were focused on those countries only. On influenza, of course, people actually thought that it was not. I mean, we know that it's a virus now, but back then they were working with this Pfeiffer's bacillus. It was a completely wrong idea, but that's what they thought. So in fact, even in India, they claimed that they had a vaccine in December 1918, but that was not really a vaccine. So we don't have enough examples really to compare, today's vaccine nationalism story with the past. I think that's how I would look at this.
Did they do vaccine trials back then?
Yeah, they had trials, and that's what they told. I mean, you would have to pass a test, and the classic case, the classic thing that scientists would do back then is to inject themselves. This was the best way to tell the world, see, I have done it and I'm surviving. And so all the great guys of the late 19th century, because this is what we call as, this whole bacteriology as a field develops germ theory as a field develops only in the late 19th century. And so all these guys are taking these shots themselves. So Hafkin, most famously, a variety of these people. There's a person in Spain for cholera who doesn't get recognition because his methods are not, up to speed. Today, on hindsight, people say that he was fairly right. And so that was pretty much the way to communicate that you're right. The Hafkin story is very interesting because there was this famous incident in Malkuwal in Punjab, and this refers to on plague, where actually a lot of people died after taking shots, and Hafkin was considered to be the culprit by the bureaucracy. But it turned out later that it was not the vaccines, but it was the needle. So that also tells you that it's the entire process. So to have it's also a lesson for today. That is, if you want to build trust, it's not just having a right vaccine. In fact, we can be very sure today that the vaccine, if it's certified, it's gone through a particular process, it's going to work. But it's not just that. It's also the whole process as to how people come in, the instruments, are they sterilized? So it's the entire chain that matters. And in Malkuwal, in early 20th century, there's a particular sort of incident where later on they found out that it was an infected needle which actually kind of gave the tetanus and killed people. So it was not the vaccine, but the infected needle which spread the disease. So that is why again the context is different, but there's still lessons to learn from back then today as to how do you go now with the mass vaccinations. Of course, in India we have more recent examples: smallpox, polio, and a variety of eradication programs. So I think that experience, I think a lot of the public health system comes with that operational memory. One of the things that the book is touching upon is memory. Right? How do you build effective collective memory? And that is why this book has been written. That is to keep a record of these particular 100 years, which are important. But I think every generation, it should really record its memory about how we dealt with polio, how we dealt with particular systems. And that is why health officers, Sujatha has got a great book on this, should actually write books about their experiences, because that will guide the next generation.
So, ma'am, going forward, when we talk about vaccines, are there any lessons that we can learn from the book, from the past?
Well, one is, as I said again, building trust. Trust is so, so important. We had a lot of problems. Polio, it took us 25 years to eradicate. And part of it is not because we don't know the technology and we don't have it, but people were just not so convinced that it will really help them to save their children from polio. And so there's a lot of investment that's made on information campaigns that have to be, explained to the people. And polio, what a huge social participation that was engaged. I mean, everybody from President of India down to the volunteer in the Mohalla clinics were engaged to eradicate polio. So that kind of trust building is very critical, because I remember when I was secretary, measles at that time was reason for 6% of under 5 children dying. Though measles was a part of the universal immunization program, but it was not really focused upon. We were so taken up by polio, and the first initial shots that the kid got. Measles is given typically in the 9th month, and it always fell off. So we had 6% children dying of measles, and so we designed a huge campaign, All India campaign, to bolster the measles immunization. UP spent a lot of time doing micro-detailed planning. And then in one village, when the worker went to give the measles shots, 4 little babies just died. They just got dizzy and they died. And then I mounted what, in my opinion, was the best team that I had access to as a Secretary of Government of India, to go and study the adverse event. The adverse event, why it happened, what was the reason, and so on. It was so problematic. And even today, I don't think we've still figured out why exactly those 4 children died, which shows how much, we need to still own up our skills to do proper adverse event reporting. But to cut the story short, the whole measles campaign had to be called off in UP for almost 2 years. So we got a huge setback. Right. So, in this vaccine, the most important thing, we keep talking about the vaccine, we talk about planning, we do talk about who can deliver it and so on, the logistics and so on, which are very critical. But more important is people's trust. I'm told somebody did a survey and they found that a majority of health workers, for example, are not willing to take the vaccine.
Yeah.
Now, when you are trying to introduce a vaccine with so much of media discussion about its pros and cons and incompleteness of phase 3 trials, a rushed job, and a measure of politicization where the government is trying to look more for the credit part of it rather than the safety of people, then the doubt arises. And that's not a very good, doesn't augur well for acceptability of the vaccine. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on the communication aspect of spreading, of allaying doubts and spreading confidence in the people and trust that this is really backed by scientific rigor and it is safe and you can take it. That message has to go down for the campaign to be successful.
Mhm.
So often overlooked, but that's so critical.
Right. So, we are approaching the end of this, but one question I have been asking everybody for the last now almost a year is not year, maybe 10 months. What will the post pandemic world look like? Will it be like the world we had or will it be different?
Yeah, I mean, my take is obviously a lot of things have been fast forwarded, right? Yeah, because of the 8 months. So more people know how to interact. I now know how to teach online, which I did not know really, 8 months ago and so on. So it might force us now to offer some programs online or at least blended online and so on. But fundamentally, I teach a course in urban economics out here. The arc of human civilization is a story of agglomeration, right? And agglomeration has its pros and cons. The cons are really amplified during a pandemic. But I do think, that is not going to fundamentally change. That is, human beings love face-to-face interaction and being in close proximity with each other. So a lot of people are saying, that will fundamentally get reshaped. I don't think so. I think we'll get back to, what we would say is normal earlier than many of us think. But definitely in terms of how we do a lot of our basic consuming, how we interact, obviously we're going to be using much more online stuff. But I'm more on the skeptical side of radical changes which are being enforced by the pandemic. Of course, a lot of it depends on how long this is going to go. I think that's the big uncertainty. So if this, for example, there's a mutation and there's a new wave of this virus, which even goes down throughout 2021, 2022, then yes, we can start talking of certain fundamental changes where everyone is learning online and so on. But I don't think that is, so as of now, I'm going to be more skeptical on that. Though having written this book, I know that epidemics can last for decades. And so cholera, plague, these were not one-year events. These were not few-month events like the influenza of 1918. Plague in India, every year for almost 10 or 15 years, there were literally, I estimate, 30 million people in India. For some months of the year, they would go outside their villages or cities and live in camps. Why? Just to escape plague. Right. So this is sort of drastic measures which used to take place in the past. In that sense, I think we are very lucky. Most of us can, lead our lives to a certain extent with just basic precautions of, wearing a mask and so on.
Ma'am, do you think, this 2.5% GDP health spend that we've been talking about for ages, do you think this will change that? It'll finally happen?
No, I don't think there'll be any drastic increase in the budgets. There will be an increase in the overall health budget. That will be for the vaccines. So, I don't expect very much of a focus on health systems as such. And, it may even, because the economy is so bad that there's really not much room left in the government for making such a dramatic increase in health budgets because they have to find money for the vaccine, which is not going to be so cheap. The second is that whatever, I'm just hoping and praying that that the increase in the budgets are not at the cost of the ongoing programs. After all, TB and other regular programs have been very, very, very badly affected by this obsessive concern with COVID, which has really affected us less than 1% of our population.
Yeah.
I think it was really made too much of it, and a lot of other programs have suffered greatly. And the impact of all that is going to be assessed after this hysteria on this COVID reduces. And it's not going to be a pretty picture. It's not going to be very pretty. That said, the second adverse fallout is the education. I feel very strongly about the way that a whole generation of school children have lost 1 year. I mean, a child who's a 6-year-old is learning every day. Every day matters to him. And here for 9 months, you've not had schools and colleges. I really think it's a failure of bureaucracy. I'm not at all convinced that it was necessary. If you can have elections and you can have temples and you can have shops and you can have normal life, I don't see why schools could not. You could have staggered timings. You could have had smaller number of children coming morning and do shift systems. There are various ways in which you could have reached out to the children. Even 2 days in a week would have made a difference for them. I think we've neglected children a lot, and that's going to have its own scars, because mental health, domestic violence, violence against women, these are all the scars that this COVID epidemic is leaving behind. The good part of it is, I think a lot of businesses and arrangements will look inwardly to see how many of the activities that they were doing as a routine, coming to office and going, could now be done at home. And if that is sort of, institutionalized, there's possibility of less traffic on the roads, and perhaps
Less pollution.
more efficient, less pollution, more efficiencies in the working. May not be on teaching side, I agree with Chinmay, but in the workspace, computers, in any case, we work on this. I don't know if that's going to really come. But a good lesson for government to really seriously work on is migrant social security for migrants, so that if next time we have a pandemic, we know that there is something called migratory populations who need to be protected, and appropriate action should be taken, not the mad way in which we dealt with it in this pandemic. So there are lots of takeaways, but then we have to have the humility to learn and accept where we made mistakes, and have the strengths to say, acknowledge where we did good work and build on that further. So there are a lot of that learning that is done, and I hope it is done sincerely and not with lots of biases.
Right. So yeah, that was a very interesting discussion, and that is all we have time for today. Best of luck for the book, Chinmay.
Yes, Chinmay, it's a fabulous book, well worth spent, and I'm really inspired. While we were all whining, sitting at home, lockdown, you were really actually using time to write a book. Wow. I mean, I am so jealous and inspired, both. I don't know which is a more dominant emotion right now.
No,
He
thanks.
was
I think
uniquely placed for the book, ma'am. He had a whole library.
Yeah.
Sorry?
The IIM library, he had at his disposal.
Yeah, I know, but even so, there were so many people. I could have also gone and said, "Can I use your library?" I'm sure they would.
Ma'am, you couldn't have gone. There was lockdown.
Yeah, no, but let me just point out, since you mentioned library, and I just sort of like to end on this note that the book is dedicated to a librarian, and my friend who actually passed away, sort of the pandemic, one of the losses of this pandemic, and it really came to a shock for many of us. But really, this book would not have been possible without the phenomenal efforts of our librarians and the amazing team which Dr. Anil Kumar had set up. Literally, I mean, there were 800 footnotes in this book, and all of them are the kind of it's a result of these guys going out and getting these resources, if not in the library, digital, literally contacting other libraries, getting me a chapter, getting me a paper. So it's really the resources of a wonderful library, and thanks to my dear friend, the late Dr. Anil Kumar, that which this book is sort of created, and the book is dedicated to him.
But
Thank you, ma'am, so much.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.